Tammany Hall, how to set up and play. First thing you'll do is lay out the game board. Next, create a supply of the political favor chips. These colors correspond to the colors of the immigrant cubes in the game. Green represent the Irish, white the English, orange the German, and blue the Italian. Next, you're going to seed each of the setup boxes with the immigrant cubes indicated on the game board. These setup boxes correspond to the zones on the game board, and the zones will become active based on the player count. So if it was a full 5-player games, zone 1, 2, and 3, all 3 zones would be active at the start of the game. Whereas in a 3-player game, only zone 1 is active. I'm setting this up for a 4-player game, so zones 1 and 2 are going to be active at the start of the game. So for each of the active zones at the start of the game, you're going to randomly distribute these cubes into those wards. The only exception is Tammany Hall. You can see it always starts with an green or an Irish immigrant cube. This is the Tammany Hall ward. The rest of these cubes for zone 1 can be randomized and just placed on each of the wards in the first zone. And then you can also see the zone's boundaries are highlighted by this dark black border. And since this is a 4-player game, I've also taken the cubes from setup box for zone 2 and randomly placed those in the wards in the second zone. The third setup box will not come into play until the second term in a 4-player game. And then you can see in a 3-player game, the third box wouldn't come into play until the third term. So these would stay here. All the rest of the immigrant cubes get placed in the bag. Next, put the year marker on year 1. The game is played over 16 years. Every 4 years is called a term, and at the end of every 4 years, you can see that an election will be held. Next, you're going to set out the city office tiles. These correspond to the descriptions here on the board. They will not come into play until the start of the second term. Now for each player, they'll get a set of ward bosses in their color. They'll place one of their ward bosses on 0 on the score track. Each player will also get 3 slander chips. Just like the city offices, these do not come into play until the start of the second term. Finally, randomly determine a start player. Play will always start with the start player and go clockwise around the table. The first step of a player's turn is to always check Castle Garden. So at the start of a player's turn, if Castle Garden is ever empty, which it is at the start of the game, you draw randomly immigrant cubes from the bag equal to the number of players plus 2 and simply place those there. So randomly draw from the bag. Since this is a 4-player game, I'll randomly draw 6. And keep in mind, you're only drawing these cubes at the start of a player's turn if Castle Garden is empty. If there's at least 1 cube here, you skip that and go straight to the player actions. On a player's turn, they can do 3 things. They can do any and all of these actions, and they can do them in any order they like. Mainly, they'll be placing pieces on the board, but they can also use their city office benefit, as well as playing their slander chip. As I mentioned, the city office and the slander chips don't come into play until the second term. So since we're in the first term of the game, the only option available to the players will be placing pieces on the board. The 2 options for placing pieces on the board, players can place 2 of their ward bosses. They can go into any active ward. Active wards are the ones with cubes in it. We know that zone 3 is not active yet. They can be placed in the same ward or separate wards. Or they can place one of their ward bosses along with an immigrant cube. If they place an immigrant cube, you'll see they're able to take a matching favor chip color of the immigrant cube they placed. So let's say the start player decides to take this action. They're going to place one of their ward bosses. They can place it in any active ward. They decide to place it here. Now they also decide to move an immigrant cube in. It has to be one of the ones here in Castle Garden. They can select any one of those. This can also go into any ward. It doesn't have to be the same ward where they placed their ward boss, but it can be. So let's say they place the Italian immigrant cube there. By helping this Italian immigrant get established in Lower Manhattan, they earn a matching favorite chip of that color. All information is public in the game. Once the player completes their actions, we now go clockwise to the next player. We check Castle Garden. We see it's not empty, so it doesn't need to be refilled. It's the purple player's turn. They decided to just place 2 ward bosses, and they decided to place them in 2 different wards. Next in clockwise order is the black player. They decide to place a ward boss in Tammany Hall, and they're going to help an immigrant get established. They're going to take this German cube, and they're going to decide to place it into this ward. Since they placed an immigrant cube, they'll take a matching favorite chip into their supply. The last player is the red player. They decide to just place 2 ward bosses, and they're going to place them both here in this ward, even though the yellow player is here. No limit to the number of ward bosses or immigrant cubes that can be placed in a ward. Once all players have taken their turn, you advance the year marker to the next year, and the starting player begins again with the actions available to them. At the end of the 4th year, there's going to be an election. So once players have finished taking their turn, we're going to resolve every active ward. Before we start the election resolution, one thing you always do is clear out any remaining cubes in Castle Garden and simply return those to the bag. So at the start of the next term, the first player to take the action will do the reseeding. So to be eligible for the election, you have to at least have one of your ward bosses. So here we can see red and yellow are actively participating in this election. You always start with zone 1, and you're going to follow the arrows. You do not pay attention to the numerical identifier for the ward. You simply start with zone 1. This would be the first election resolved, then this one, this one, this one, and you can see the arrow goes here and ends with Tammany Hall for zone 1. Then you would start with zone 2 if it was active. You would start with the first ward in zone 2 and then follow the arrows and resolve the elections that way. If zone 3 was active, this would be the first ward resolved, and then again just simply follow the arrows for ward resolution. To resolve an election in a ward, each ward boss is going to count as 1 vote for that player. In addition, players are going to be allowed to do a blind bid of their political favor chips, as long as the political favor chips match one of the immigrant cube colors within the ward. So for example, the red player has 1 blue favor chip and 3 English, but we can see there are no white cubes in this ward. So these aren't even eligible to be used for the blind bid. Only blue and orange are eligible, since those are the only cubes in the region. The yellow player has 2 blues and orange. All 3 of these are eligible. So we can see that the red player is going to start with 2 votes, since they have 2 ward bosses, and they could potentially add a 3rd. So the maximum they could get is 3. Remember, this is all public, so all players kind of show what the possibilities are. The yellow player has 1 vote, but they could potentially add all 3 of these favor chips in the blind bid. So players will secretly determine how many of their favorite chips they want to play. All players put their hands out and simultaneously reveal the amount of favorite chips that they have dedicated to the election. So yellow didn't want to take a chance. They used all 3 of their favorite chips. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4 votes, where red only has 1, 2, 3 votes. Win or lose, all of these favorite chips are returned to the supply now. All ward bosses are removed from the ward, except the winning player is allowed to keep only 1 ward boss in the region. If there was a tie, when you added up the ward bosses plus the favor chips, nobody wins the election and all ward bosses get removed. Any ward bosses that come out of the region just simply get returned to the player's supply, along with any favor chips that were spent on the election. They get returned to the general supply. Before we move on to resolve the next ward, the first 4 wards on this Lower East Side of Manhattan, the winner gets a special power immediately resolved when the election's resolved. So since the yellow player won this ward, they get to select an immigrant cube of their choice, just take it out of the bag, and they can place it in any active ward. They could place the cube here to add to the amount of immigrant population that they're controlling, or they could even add it to an upcoming election to sway the possibilities in that vote. Maybe yellow still has a lot of orange cubes, and they decide to take a German cube, an orange cube, out of the bag and add it to this ward, now making his favorite chips, his orange favorite chips, eligible in the election. So the winner of this first ward gets to select any color cube out of the bag, place it in any active region. The same power goes for this second ward. The winner of this third ward simply gets to select a favorite chip, any color of their choice, and the winner of this ward also gets to select a favorite chip. It's only these first 4 wards that provide the special power. So since the yellow player won this first ward, they've decided to just take an orange cube and add it to the ward that they already control now. Now we move on to the next ward. We can see the yellow player is the only player with a ward boss in this ward. So they, by default, automatically win this election. So you don't need to go through any election procedure. But you can still see that this ward provides a special bonus. So just like this ward, they get to select a cube of their choice. Maybe this time they select a green cube. Instead of adding it to any of these wards, maybe they want to put it in this one to make green favorite chips now eligible. Once we resolve this, we go to the next one. Here we can see 3 players are eligible to be in the election. Again, each ward boss counts as a vote, and all 3 players simultaneously would announce how many eligible favorite chips they have, simultaneously reveal those, and then resolve the winner of the election. It's only the player with the most votes gets to win the election and keep 1 ward boss in the ward. All the other players remove their ward bosses. Again, if there's a tie for who wins the election, all ward bosses get removed and nobody gets the ward. So you continue resolving elections following the arrows for each of the active zones and wards. So at the end of resolving all the elections, at most you'll have 1 ward boss in each ward based on who won that election. You may have some wards with no ward bosses if nobody was able to win the election. The first thing you do is to award political favor chips based on who has the most immigrant cubes of that color. They would gain 3 favor chips. And if tied, all players gain those 3 favor chips. You do this before scoring any victory points for wards and before determining who the mayor is. The reason why is because if there's ever a tie for the mayor, it's based on who has the highest number of favor chips. So you award these before determining the mayor, because these may influence the outcome of that determination. So for each of the 4 colors, simply determine which player controls the highest number of cubes in that color. So for example, we'd start with the Irish. Green, we see the yellow controls none here. They control 1 and none here. So the yellow player only controls 1 green cube. The red player, I'm looking at the wards they control. They also only control 1. The purple player only controls 1, but we can see the black player controls 1 here and 1 here. So they control 2, which is the highest. So they control the highest number of green cubes. If you'd like, you can put one of their meeples here just to indicate that they, after this first election, controlled the highest number. And then the black player would get 3 favor chips, matching that cube color. So I've gone through and did the tally. The red player had the highest number of English immigrant cubes, so they got 3 favor chips. The yellow player had the most orange, so they got 3 orange favor chips. But when I counted the Italian cubes on the board, the yellow player had 1 and the black player had 1, and those were the highest. So they both tied for the highest number control of the Italian immigrant cubes, so they actually both get 3 favor chips. After you've awarded the favor chips, now you're ready to score victory points based on the players that won the elections. So every ward is worth 1 victory point, with the exception of Tammany Hall, that's worth 2 victory points. So we can see the yellow player won 1, 2, 3 wards. So I've moved them up 3 points on the victory track. The purple player only won a single ward, so they've got 1 point. The red player won 1, 2, 3, 4, so they've got 4 points. And the black player won 1, 2, but they won Tammany Hall, so this is worth 2 points. So 1 plus 2, they earned 3 points on the victory point track. Finally, you can now determine the mayor. The mayor is simply the player that won the election for the highest number of wards. Here we can see the red player won 4 wards, so they get to be the mayor. Tammany Hall only counts for 1 ward here, even though it was awarded 2 victory points for winning it. So the black has 2 wards, yellow has 3, purple has 1, and red has 4. So they're going to win the title of mayor. And they're going to get this city office card. You can see it immediately scores them 3 victory points. That's the same 3 victory points that are indicated on the board. So red would immediately go up 3 points. If there's ever a tie, if both players had the same number of wards on the board, you would simply look at which player now has the highest number of favorite chips in all colors. So simply count a player's set of favorite chips. The highest would break the tie. If there's still a tie, then you find out who has the highest number of green favorite chips. Still tied, highest number of white, then the highest number of orange, then the highest number of blue favorite chips. If all of these tiebreakers result in nobody winning the mayor title, then it simply reverts to who was the mayor the last term. And if it happened to happen on this first term of the game, then nobody wins the title of mayor. But usually there will be a mayor awarded, they get their card, and now it's their job to assign the city offices to the other players. Each office will get assigned one of these city office cards. It's up to the mayor. Since this is a 4-player game, one of these city offices won't be selected. It's the choice of the mayor. They simply give each of these cards to the player of their choice, and this will give them a special power for the duration of the next term. Once the offices have been assigned, you can now slide the year marker forward. If there were some remaining setup boxes to set up, so now we know Zone 3 is going to be active, simply randomly place those in those wards, and now you're ready to start the next year. The start player is always the player that won the mayor card. So this is going to be the start player, and now we're going to go clockwise, starting with this player. At the start of a new term, the first action you'll always do is to reseed Castle Garden, because you'll remember at the start of the election sequence, we always clear these out. So this will be empty at the start of the mayor's first turn. Starting in the second term onwards, one of the actions that players can take on their turn in addition to these other actions is to use their city office benefit. Always place the meeple here after assignment so all players know which powers the players have. But let's take a look at these. The deputy mayor gain 1 political favoriteship of any color each turn. So at the start of your turn, during this term, simply take a favoriteship of your color. So that'll earn the player 4 favorites throughout the duration of their turn. The council president allows the player to lock up a ward twice per term, but only once per turn. And then when it's locked up, no ward bosses, no immigrant cubes could be removed or added to these locked up wards. So that's what these gray tokens are for. So let's say the black player was the council president. On their turn, they realized, hey, they're the only one with a meeple in Tammany Hall. So they're going to use their lockup power. They can use it once per turn. They decide to lock up Tammany Hall. So now no cubes, no ward bosses can be added or removed to this ward. And that goes for everything, you know, awarding these powers and so forth. So this basically has guaranteed that the black player is going to win the election in the Tammany Hall ward. Now the council president has a second lockup token. So on another turn during this term, they can lock up another ward. So they decide when to use it. They can lock up 2 wards throughout their term, but they can only lock up once per turn. The chief of police is allowed to arrest or remove one immigrant cube from any ward each turn. The only rule is you cannot remove the last immigrant cube from a ward. So the player couldn't decide to remove this, since that would leave that empty. They can never remove the last cube, but they could decide, you know what, I'm going to arrest this Irish immigrant and just put it back into the bag. And they can do that each turn while they hold this power. Finally, the precinct chairman, they can move one immigrant cube to an adjacent ward each turn, but the same rules apply. You cannot remove the last immigrant from a ward. So the player could decide, you know what, I'm going to move this cube to this cube. To be adjacent, it has to share a border. Diagonals do not count as adjacent. What they couldn't do is slide this one over here because that would have been the last cube in that ward. But once per turn, they can move one cube from any ward to another adjacent ward. The mayor, you'll remember, has no special power because they got those 3 additional victory points. These city offices will reset at the end of each election, whereas the new mayor, at the end of that election, will reassign the city offices to the players. The other action a player can do on their turn is to use one of their slander chips. They have 3 slander chips throughout the game. If they don't use them, each unused slander chip will be worth a victory point at the end of the game, and they can only slander once per term. To slander, you have to target a ward boss in a ward where you also have a ward boss. So let's say it's the red player's turn. Remember, you can do these in any order. So let's say the red player decides, you know what, on this turn, I'm going to place a ward boss in that region. I am also going to maybe place another ward boss in this region, because one of their actions they can do is to place 2 ward bosses. So now they decide to target this yellow player for slander. To target the player, they simply have to pay their slander chip. That'll just go back to the general supply. Now they have to use one of their political favor chips matching an immigrant population. Basically, they're spreading the rumors through that population. So the red player could spend a blue favor chip or an orange favor chip. So they'll decide to spend the orange favor chip along with their slander chip, and this would remove one ward boss from the targeted player from the ward. Now, if possible, the red player could attempt to do a double slander during that slander action. To do a double slander, you have to target the same player in an adjacent ward. Again, remember, diagonal doesn't count, has to share a border. So the only adjacent wards are these 2. There's no yellow player here, but there is a yellow player or a yellow ward boss here, and that was the same player they targeted. So they can attempt to double slander now. They do not have to discard an additional black chip. The 1 black chip allows them to single or double slander, but they do have to use the matching color of the favor chips that they used. So they could not use green favor chips to do the double slander here. Since they used orange, it has to match a color here. So if this orange cube wasn't here, a double slander wouldn't even be possible. But since there is an orange cube here, you now have to pay 2 favor chips in addition to the one you paid for the single slander to let the rumor spread to another adjacent region, target the same player, discard your favorite chips, and now you've executed a double slander. Just remember, on the slandering, there is no slandering in the first term of the game, and you can only slander once per term. But keep in mind, you can do all 3 of these actions in any order. As we saw, you could take this action first, where you place your pieces on the board, then maybe you execute a slander move, and then maybe you use your city office to lock up the ward after you've got a ward boss removed from it. So play will continue. Just always remember, at the end of now the 8th, the 12th, and the 16th year, you're always going to conduct elections. You always conduct them for all the active wards, starting with Zone 1. So this ward, for example, will have 4 elections that takes place in it throughout the course of the game. At the end of this last year, you will go through the election process just like you normally do, resolve all the elections, pass out the favor chips based on who controls the highest number of cubes, award the victory points, and just like normal, you're going to determine the mayor. The mayor would get the mayor chip for that final election, they'd get the 3 victory points. There's no need, obviously, for them to hand out any city offices, but that final mayor victory will award the 3 victory points. After you complete the sequence for that final election, there will be some final victory points. We mentioned that each unused black slander chip will give the player 1 victory point. And then you're also going to see who has the most chips of each color. Green favor chips in their possession. They would get 2 victory points, and you'd award 2 victory points for the highest number of favor chips by each player. And if there's a tie, all tied players would score those 2 victory points. After those final victory points are awarded, most victory points will win the game. If there's a tie, you would use your normal mayor tiebreak rules. If there's still a tie, whoever won that final mayoral race in the last election would be the final tiebreaker. And that should be everything you need to set up and play Tammany Hall.